And thank you everybody for being here this evening. Quick update on what the Libertarian Party of Chicago is up to. My petitions for City Council got challenged, so I will not be on the ballot in February. I will, however, be a write-in candidate in the 1st Ward along with Molly Mae Brady in the 2nd Ward. If you live in these wards, please write us in this upcoming election season. I am here this evening to discuss Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. This Christmas season marks the 175th since its publication. Because I went to public school, I have a generally familiar with Dickens' career, and I never read any of his work until I read this book for my presentation. I also watched for good measure the 1935 British adaptation Scrooge with Seymour Hicks and the 1988 comedy Scrooge with Bill Murray twice, both of which are great adaptations. When my esteemed colleague Charlie Padoff asked me to be part of this presentation, he said I'd be defending the free market, and I just so happened to be reading Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for a Free Economy by Father Robert Sirico, which I've left down over there. So I'll be citing that book for my portion of the program. I'll also be citing the Time article by historian John Boych entitled The Real Reason Charles Dickens Wrote A Christmas Carol to provide context. A bit about Father Robert Sirico. He's a Catholic priest and founder of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, a think tank that focuses on free market economics and theology. Prior to joining the priesthood, he was a leftist and a minister in the LGBT-friendly Metropolitan Community Church, where he performed some of the first same-sex marriages in the country. He doesn't recount any of those episodes in his book. However, he does talk about rolling a joint for Jane Fonda during one of Tom Hayden's campaigns for office. But he does do what a lot of folks do. He reads books like The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, and he becomes a huge supporter of free markets. His ministry then changed focus, and the Acton Institute was founded. His brother also happens to be Tony Sirico, who played Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. Defending the Free Market is a good primer for newbies who may be interested in learning more about economics. It is also lighter on theology than I expected. Since Christmas is a Christian holiday, I thought his insights would be useful in this talk. Now, we're all familiar with the Christmas Carol, and if you're unfamiliar, you're out of luck, so I won't be providing a synopsis, but I'll be answering the questions that appear in the title of this program. Should Ebenezer have told the ghost to get lost? No. If Scrooge demanded the ghost to go back from where they came, then Scrooge would not have found redemption, and there would be no story, no countless adaptations, and thus no presentation this evening. Perhaps the question is supposed to imply that atypical capitalists are misers who would always oppose suggestions to be nice to your employees. A Christmas Carol is a Christmas Carol socialist propaganda on the plight of the working poor. First, let's get a working definition of socialism. Father Sirico gives an anecdote in his book about the importance of definitions. As a college student studying in England, he was out at the pub with his friends, and he called a waitress a pro for remembering their order without writing it down. Sirico learned immediately that pro means prostitute after a solemn and embarrassed silence descended upon his friends. He says, quote, "The story illustrates a more generally applicable point. It's important to define your terms and to understand what you're talking about. That goes for politics as much as it does for prostitution. Not just because some politicians may behave like prostitutes." So here are a couple definitions of socialism, and tell me if you agree. Worker ownership of the means of production. Do you guys agree with that? An economic system characterized by government planning, wealth redistribution, and social services. Would you guys agree with that definition? Yeah, so here's kind of a joke definition. When the government does things. Would you agree with that? No. In all these instances, A Christmas Carol does not advocate for any of these things, and thus is not socialist propaganda. According to Broich, Dickens set out to write his pamphlet-turned-book in spring of 1843, having just read a government report on child labor in the United Kingdom. The report took the form of a compilation of interviews with children, compiled by a journalist friend of Dickens that detailed their crushing labors. Dickens read the testimony of girls who sewed dresses for the expanding market of middle-class consumers. They regularly worked 16-hour days, 6 days a week, rooming like Martha Cratchit above the factory floor. He read of 8-year-old children who dragged coal carts through tiny subterranean passages over a standard 11-hour workday. These were not exceptional stories, but ordinary. Dickens wrote to one of the government investigators that the descriptions left him, quote, stricken. Broich goes on, Friedrich Engels read the same report on child labor that Dickens did, and with his collaborator Karl Marx, envisioned an eventual revolution. Dickens was very much anti-revolutionary. In fact, he implied that revolutionary was the fearsome consequence of not solving the problem some other way, unquote. Yes, Dickens had sympathy for the plight of the poor. Yes, he was appalled by the poor working conditions. Well, that does not make one a socialist. Sorry, Charlie. Just isn't so that A Christmas Carol is socialist propaganda. Is Scrooge the typical story of a capitalist? Let's get a working definition and tell me if you agree. A capitalist, quote, a person who owns capital. Would you guys agree? Yes. All right. A person who can buy labor. Would that person be a capitalist?
A person what?
A person who can buy labor.
Yes.
Yeah. A person who supports an economic model characterized by private ownership that meets production, free markets, and voluntary exchange. Would you agree with that definition?
Yes.
A person who engages in capitalistic acts. Would you agree with that one? Most, if not all, of these not only apply to Ebenezer Scrooge, they apply to Charles Dickens. Dickens was in the book writing and magazine publishing business. Certainly he owned the means of production, a typewriter, pen, or printing press perhaps, and he employed others. I can't account for whether he kept his office warm during Christmas or if he gave his employee raises or prized turkeys. I went to public school after all. But I'll assure you, I'll assume that he has, and I'm aware of any hypocrisy on his part. Scrooge was a moneylender. He owned capital. He could buy labor. He was a miser who treated his employees like garbage, and he was a man consumed by greed. He loved money so much that he lost his fiancée and grew up to be a misanthropic curmudgeon. For what is a profit, man? So for what shall it profit a man? If shall he gain the whole world and not lose his soul? Asked Christ in the Gospels. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from their faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows, wrote St. Paul to St. Timothy. Is Scrooge's story typical? It's hard to say. Capitalists, like any other group, should be looked at individually. For every Scrooge, how many Dickenses are there? Are there any modern-day Scrooges? Of course, but capitalism has evolved since 1843. Societal attitudes toward poverty and workplace management have changed, with some part surely due to the influence of Dickens. Today, employers offer benefits that would stupefy Bob Cratchit. Working conditions have greatly improved. Employers continue to enter contracts with labor unions. People like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Michael Bloomberg, and Charles Koch are among the top philanthropists in the world. Companies like Whole Foods have a degree of workplace democracy, while companies like Publix are employee-owned. Just as socialism isn't a synonym for sympathy for the poor, neither is capitalism a synonym for greed. If Dickens's goal in publishing A Christmas Carol was to inspire people to be more generous to their fellow man, including employers treating their employees better, then I'd say he succeeded. So to answer the question, there is no typical capitalist. I'll instead argue that the story of Scrooge is a Christian story of redemption, and that the best way to improve the lives of the Cratchits is through free markets. The fact that this is a Christian story is best demonstrated by Bob Cratchit when talking about Tiny Tim. Cratchit says of Tiny Tim, while Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present watch, he told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. So what is the gospel? The Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, for us and our salvation, came down from heaven and was incarnate and was made man, according to Christians. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent ye and believe in the gospel, says Christ in the gospel of St. Mark. According to the gospel of St. Matthew, Christ says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." According to Christians, because Christ's sacrifice on the cross, a fallen mankind can have paradise, including a man like Scrooge, who was overtaken by his greed and hatred of his fellow man. Concerning greed, Sirico writes, "Greed isn't good, and it isn't the essence of capitalism. Greed is not necessary to the process of wealth creation in a capitalist economy. Greed exists in every capitalist economy, of course, because you find greed everywhere there are human beings." He continues, "Greed is known as one of the 7 capital sins because greedy people will go to great lengths to obtain their object, committing other sins along the way to getting what they want, even to the point of using fellow human beings as instruments. Like St. Paul the Apostle on the road to Damascus, Scrooge is transformed. He is redeemed and reborn. His first acts upon learning of the error of his ways are to buy a turkey for the Cratchits, raise Bob Cratchit's salary, vowing to help with Tiny Tim, and cherishing every Christmas going forward. Then shall the king say upon them on his right hand, "Come ye, blessed my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you in the foundation of the world. For I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. And I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. And I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me." Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, "Lord, when saw we thee and hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When we saw thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when thee are sick, or in prison, and ye came upon thee?" And the king shall answer and say upon them, "Verily I say unto you, insomuch as ye has done unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done unto me," teaches Christ. And thus I believe the Christmas Carol is a Christian story. Now, why are free markets the best way to help the Cratchits? Sirico writes in the first chapter, "Rightly understood, capitalism is the economic component of the natural order of liberty. Capitalism offers wide ownership of property, fair and equal rules for all, strict adherence to the rule of ownership, opportunities for charity, and the wise use of resources. Everywhere it has really been tried, it has meant creativity, growth, abundance, and most of all, the economic application of the principle that every human being has dignity and should have that dignity respected. And please don't tell me the free market is a myth, simply because it has never existed in a pure form anywhere. Tell that to my grandfather. He came over to America with $35 in his pocket. Yet almost all of his 13 children went on to become middle class. Capitalism, rightly understood and pursued, has lifted untold millions out of abject poverty and allowed them to use skills and talents they never would have discovered, and to build opportunities their grandparents never dreamed were possible. The free economy is a dream worthy of our spiritual imaginations." In another chapter entitled, "Want to Help the Poor? Start a Business," Sirico writes, "Here is the simple reality. The past 200 years have seen the astounding rise of billions of the world's population out of abject poverty. But that in itself is not the astonishing thing. The amazing thing is that this has been accomplished not by charitable endeavors, much less by government aid programs. What rescued hundreds of people from the direst poverty? Simple, humdrum business. I'm not saying that government policy and religious culture are unimportant in generating a climate in which businesses can thrive. And I'm not saying there aren't legitimate concerns about the political and moral effects of globalization. What I am saying is that the process that lifted these billions of human beings out of poverty during the last 2 centuries, and particularly in the last 50 years, wasn't charity or public aid. Charitable efforts are vital expressions of human solidarity that, when carried out wisely, play a crucial role in human suffering. They are not the usual way people escape poverty. The normal way people rise out of poverty is through enterprise and markets, through ordinary business. The data is incontrovertible. When people are free to pursue enterprise and connect regional and global markets, the economy develops and the great masses of people rise out of poverty. So the best way to provide for the Cratchits is to have a society that embraces free markets, plain and simple. And let me end with this, and please join along if you wish. Think of your fellow man, lending a helping hand, put a little love in your heart. You see it's getting late, oh please don't hesitate, put a little love in your heart, and the world will be a better place, and the world will be a better place for you and me. All right. God bless us, everyone. Thank you.
All right, let's welcome Corina. All right, Corina.
I'd like to thank Charlie for allowing me to give this presentation at the College of Complexes, and thank you for being here. All right, so who is Scrooge? Scrooge, it's a portmanteau of to screw and to gouge. Scrooge. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out. Generous fire, secret and self-contained, solitary as an oyster. A cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, and his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always with him, about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain was open to entreaty. Foul weather did not know where to have him. The heaviest rain, snow, and hail and sleet could boast the advantage over him, only in one respect. They often, quote, came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind man's dog appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. What was the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge? So Scrooge is an individualist. He's not trying to be popular. He doesn't care what people think. One day in his office, some gentlemen show up. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provisions to the poor and destitute who had suffered greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want. of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts. And Scrooge asked, are there prisons? Are there union workhouses? The treadmill? The poor laws? Oh yes, they're very busy. So what shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there. And then over the evening, he is visited by his former partner, Bob Marley, who is dead. That's how the novel starts.
Jacob Marley.
Jacob Marley. Marley is dead. This is the beginning of the novel, and that was firmly established. And then Marley says you're going to be visited by 3 ghosts. And then there's a transformation in character, and then the next day, Scrooge approaches these men, the same men who were asking for his donation. My dear sir, said Scrooge, quickening his pace, taking the old gentleman by both hands. How do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir. Mr. Scrooge? Yes, said Scrooge, that is my name, and I fear that it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness? Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. Lord bless me, cried the gentleman, as if his breath was taken away. My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious? If you please, said Scrooge, and not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor? My dear sir, said the other, shaking hands with him. I don't know what to say to such munificent... Don't say anything, please, retorted Scrooge. Come and see me. Will you come and see me? I will, cried the old gentleman. And it was clear he meant to do it. Thank ye, said Scrooge. I am much obliged to you, and I thank you 50 times. God bless you. So there's the new Scrooge.
Thanks, Corey. Can you do it again?
Now,
Please.
the question is, Scrooge, the story of a typical capitalist or a socialist propaganda on the plight of the working poor. Should Ebenezer have told the ghosts to get lost? Well, my first piece of research was Charles Paydop's writing, and the prior speaker said this, but this seemingly timeless story hides the fact that it was very much the product of a particular moment in history. It's our third meaning to weigh in on the plight of the working poor, the onset of the Industrial Revolution, girls' dresses for an expanding market of middle-class consumers, for example, regularly work 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, grooming like Martha Kraft should above a factory floor. Workers laboring in precursor of the assembly line were valued and measured by how many nails they could hammer. And then he says, Frederick Engels also saw the same conditions that Dickens did, and with his collaborator Karl Marx, envisioned an eventual revolution in the Communist Manifesto, also written in England around the same time. Dickens, however, was very much anti-revolutionary, so this isn't a socialist novel. In fact, he implied that revolution was a fearsome consequence of not solving the problem some other way. The real solution is to be more charitable. Scrooge was first visited by the ghost of, after his former partner, Jacob Marley, he's visited by the ghost of Christmas past, and there we see Fezziwig. And Fezziwig was the man who Scrooge apprenticed for with another student prior to having his own business. And Fezziwig is a capitalist, but Fezziwig is very merry. He dances, he puts out a large feast and hires these musicians, and he has these gleaming legs in his life. He takes his wife and dances, and it's very merry. And then at 11 o'clock, people must go, and Scrooge and his cohort say, you know, they sing the praises of Fezziwig, and the ghost of Christmas passes, but that must have cost him a couple pounds for all it was worth. So, but this is a very popular wealthy man. And then there's also the second ghost, is the ghost of Christmas present. And here we see the beautiful poor and suffering, the gorgeous poor. They still have the Christmas spirit, and that's what's really important. We go over to the people in the mines and the family. They hold hands and they sing a Christmas carol There's people in a ship in the middle of the sea. They have to be out at sea in a storm, and yet they're still able to sing a song and keep the Christmas cheer. And then in the lighthouse, which is surrounded by this gale wind and the sea, these two men are able to hold hands and be cheerful. It's a beautiful poor and suffering. This is a family novel. It's not controversial. Charles Dickens needed a bestseller, and he meant to make money. He had a prior novel called Martin Chuzzlewit's, which did sell. It wasn't a flop, but the sales were disappointing. It didn't sell as much as his prior novels. And then he himself had just had a new child. He lived a very lavish life in a home with multiple rooms and servants, and he spent more than he could afford, as did his father and brothers. His father, Joe Dickens, wasn't hesitant to take out a loan in Charles Dickens' good name and borrow money from one of Charles Dickens' good friends. So Charles Dickens called his father and brother blood petitioners. So this really was meant to be a best-selling novel, not to create a political movement or a large controversy. He wanted to make something that would sell well, as does Walt Disney or Pixar. It was meant to be a family-friendly novel. There are socialist novels that differ from A Christmas Carol, and they exist. One of the most striking examples is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. He wrote, that was published in 1904. Jurgis comes from Lithuania, and he isn't the victim of one bad boss. He's a victim of systems. He comes to the United States, to the New World, and it's just all set against him. The people who sell him a house, which is made of cardboard, the people who employ him, the people at the union, the Democratic Party who get him to vote, the people at the bar that take the $100 from him and take advantage of the fact that he doesn't speak English and they won't break his $100. He's oppressed by a large system again and again and again, and near the end of the novel decides to try to go for socialism. The Iron Heel by Jack London, written in 1908, and The Grapes of Wrath in 1939, featuring a family that was living in Oklahoma. During the Dust Bowl, they're kicked off their land, go through California, and are assaulted again and again in the different worker camps by the police, by the employers, and it's a tough life. Some of the owners were kind because they hated what they had to do, and some of them were angry because they hated to be cruel, and some of them were cold because they long ago found that one could not be an owner unless one were cold. And all of them were caught into something larger than themselves. Some of them hated the mathematics that drove them, and some of them were afraid. Some of them worshipped the mathematics because it provided a refuge from thought and from feeling. If a bank or a finance company owned the land, the owner man said, the bank or the company needs, wants, insists, must have, as though the bank or company were a monster, and with thought and feeling, which ensnared him. These last would take no responsibility for the banks or the companies because they were men and slaves, while the banks were machines and masters, all the same. Some of the owner men were a little proud to be slaves to such a cold and powerful master. The owner men sat in the cars and explained, you know the land is poor, you've scrapped it all along and enough. And then the men report, yes, but the bank is only made of men. No, you're wrong there. Quite wrong there. The bank is something else than men. It happens that every man in the bank hates what the bank does, yet the bank does it. The bank is something more than men, I tell you. It is a monster. Men made it, but they can't control it. There you see more of a socialist writing. The actual answer that Charles Dickens is proposing is charity. And let me just talk a little bit more about charity and how much charity is used to actually very much sustain the system, very much not to overturn the system. Oscar Wilde, he wrote an essay called The Soul of Man Under Socialism in 1891. And he says that there's this vulgar and incredible poverty and starvation, and then he says, The proper aim is to try to reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty will be impossible. And the altruistic virtues have really prevented the carrying out of the same. Just as the worst slave owners were those who were kind to the slaves and so prevented the horror of the system from being realized by those who suffered from it and understood by those who contemplated it, so in the present state of things in England, 1891, the Gilded Age, the people who do the most harm are the people who try to do the most good. And at last we have the spectacle of men who really study the problem and know life, educated men who lived in the Far East End, coming forward and imploring the community to restrain an altruistic impulse of charity, benevolence, and the like. They do so on the ground that such charity degrades and demoralizes. They are perfectly right. Charity creates a multitude of sins. He also goes on to talk about poor men. He says, no poor man, a poor man who is ungrateful, unthrifty, discontented, and rebellious is probably a real personality and has much in him. He is at any rate a healthy protest. As for the virtuous poor, one can pity them, but one cannot possibly admire them. They've made private terms with the enemy. They've sold their birthright for the very bad pottage. They must be extraordinarily stupid. I can quite understand a man accepting laws that protect private property and admit its accumulation as long as he himself is able, under these conditions, to realize some form of beautiful and intellectual life. But it's almost incredible to me how a man whose life is marred and made hideous by such laws can possibly acquiesce in their continuance.
Oh, I don't have baked.
And that was Oscar Wilde. George Bernard Shaw in 1905, he writes Major Barbara, and he has a character
I've been ready.
far more suave or nuanced than Scrooge. Eldershaft, who is the father of Barbara, who's the Major Barbara of the Salvation Army.
Cream of mushroom,
And Undershaft confronts one of the people at the Salvation Army. He says,
salad.
have you ever been
I'll
in
do
love
a
with
salad.
poverty like St. Francis?
What do you got?
Have you ever been in love
Ranch
with
French
dirt
style
like St. Simeon? Have you ever been in love with disease and suffering
Greek will
like
be
our
fine.
nurses and philanthropists? Such passions are not virtues, but the most unnatural of all the vices. This love of the common people may please an earl's granddaughter or a university professor, but I have been a common man and a poor man, and it has no romance for me. Leave it to the poor to pretend that poverty is a blessing. Leave it to the coward to make a religion of his cowardice by preaching humility. We know better than that. We three must stand together above the common people. How else can we help their children to climb up beside us? Barbara, his daughter, must belong to us, not to the Salvation Army. And Cousins said, well, I can only say that if you think that you'll get her away from the Salvation Army by taking her, by talking to her as you've been talking to me, you don't know Barbara. My friend, I never asked her what I can buy. Do I understand you to imply that you can buy Barbara? No, but I can buy the Salvation Army. Quite impossible. You shall see. All religious organizations exist by selling themselves to the rich, not the army. That's the church of the poor. All the more reason for buying it. I don't think you quite know what the army does for the poor. Oh, yes, I do. It draws their teeth. That's enough for me as a man of business. Nonsense, it makes them sober. I prefer sober workmen. The profits are larger. Honest. Honest workmen are the most economical. Attached to their homes. So much the better. They will put up with anything sooner than change their shop. Happy. An invaluable safeguard against revolution. Unselfish. Indifferent to their own interests, which suits me exactly. With their thoughts on heavenly things. And not the trade unionism or socialism. Excellent. You really are an infernal old rascal. Margaret Sanger, she's trying to get at the root of poverty and help teach women how to use contraception and to provide research better contraception. At one point, so she's traveling around the world and traveling around the country. She wrote her autobiography in 1915. So many hundreds of letters have come to me, not only in English, but also Hungarian, Bohemian, Polish, Yiddish, clamoring for information. that I had every reason to suppose what I had to say was going to be welcome on Halsted Street in Chicago. I was incredulous when I met an unforeseen resistance. Holos and similar settlements had been established to help the poor to help themselves, but I found that although social agencies had originally striven to win the confidence by opening milk stations and day nurseries, this aim had been somewhat obscured in the interest of sheer efficiency. Many welfare workers had come to treat individuals merely as cases to be cataloged, arrogantly proclaiming that they knew what was best for the poor. A type had developed. Those who belonged to it were lacking in human sympathy. Instead, they expanded their own egos through domination. She also talks about one of her benefactors, Frederick A. Blossom, who was had a doctorate and was a manager of Associated Charities in Cleveland. And she said, since I had nearly a week before my scheduling, the time fitted very nicely. I seized then on the occasion. I did not expect any definite action, but did yearn to arouse dissatisfaction over the smoothing off of the top. To say these social workers were plodding along in their organizations, that I thought their accomplishments were temporary, and that charity was only a feather duster flicking from the surface particles which merely settled somewhere else. They could never attain their ideal of eliminating the problems of the masses until the breeding of the unending stream of unwanted babies was stopped. And now I have discussed charities. I've argued that the novel is not socialist. He's going along with charity, and charity kind of helps to maintain the status quo. But there's a final book which shows charity as being extremely treacherous. Winner take all, the elite charade of changing the world by Anand Giridharadas. And this is a book that came out this year. It was published this year. Anand has spoken about this in YouTube. He's spoken at Politics and Prose and has given other talks at Google. And you can check these out online. I think they're insightful. Amazon describes this book as an insider's groundbreaking investigation of how the global elite's effort to quote-unquote change the world preserves the status quo and obscures their role in causing the problems they later seek to solve. They have tried to help by taking ownership of the problem all around us. The winners in our highly inequitable status quo declare themselves partisans of change. They know the problem and they want to be part of the solution. Actually, they want to lead the search for solutions. They believe that their solutions deserve to be the forefront of social change. They may join or support movements initiated by ordinary people looking to fix aspects of their society. More often, though, these elites start initiatives of their own, taking on social change as though it were just another stock in their portfolio or a corporation to restructure, because they are in charge of these attempts of social change. The attempts naturally reflect their biases. The initiatives mostly aren't democratic, nor do they reflect collective problem solving or universal solutions. Rather, they favor the use of the private sector and its charitable spoils, the market way of looking at things and bypassing government. They reflect highly influential view that the winners of an unjust status quo and the tools and mentalities and values that help them win are the secret to redressing the injustices. Those at the greatest risk of being resented in an age of inequality are thereby recast of our saviors from an age of inequality. Socially minded financiers at Goldman Sachs seek to change the world through win-win initiatives like green bonds and impact investing. Tech companies like Uber and Airbnb cast themselves as empowering the poor by allowing them to chauffeur people around and rent out spare rooms. Management consultants and Wall Street brains seek to convince the social sector that they should guide its pursuit of the greater equality by assuming board seats and leadership positions. Change the world, fix the problem, do anything, but don't raise my taxes and don't add any additional regulations.
Pardon me. I have to get through.
Sorry.
To answer the second question, should Ebenezer have told the ghost to get lost? He should not, because the ghost really functioned as a help. The ghost told him how much it cost him his single-minded pursuit of money, and he and made him realize how much of a social deficit he was at. The biggest victim of Scrooge's life, the biggest victim of Scrooge's behavior was Scrooge. Scrooge himself, not only did he keep his office cold, he kept his own home cold. Not only was he miserly to others, he wasn't somebody who made a lot of money and then went to Las Vegas and owned multiple Porsches, Lamborghinis, Mercedes-Benz, and a Jaguar. He was so miserly. Had he lived today, he'd be owning a Volkswagen from 1967 that's been repaired multiple times. He really and the ghost did offer him sage advice. He didn't have a social, in a sense, he didn't have a social safety net or a social circle. Wasn't invited to parties. Was a butt of jokes. So I thought that the re-examination by the ghosts were valuable to him. He did raise Bob Cratchit's salary, but let me remind you, Bob Cratchit was his only employee. He wasn't in charge of a factory and raising the price of 1,000 factory workers. Thank you.
Oh, I'm not gonna, that'll come when we have the limitless supply, hopefully around Earth Day, when I have the chance to debate Dennis Nelson again. However, we do have my own thoughts on Scrooge and everything else. We just gotta make sure that everything works properly. Scrooge was a capitalist, and what he did directly benefited the poor. Why, you say? He was providing essentials, other services to others by having a business serving the needs of a marketplace. He was a banker, and he loaned money to people to improve business. He loaned money out at interest to help people's lives get better. In fact, he was the one who provided the capital for capitalism. And, you know, that's something to be thoughtful for. What he did with his own money in his own life was his business. He didn't need the ghosts. He just needed a good PR man to help him boost his businesses even more. You know, but I'm not really the best expert to tell Scrooge what to do or how to live his life. But I think Elmer Fudd may know a little bit more about business and how it operates. Let's watch. It's about 3 minutes.
Oh, twat it. Now, will somebody explain why the elves haven't returned yet?
But I want to stay in business. How can I do it?
Business? Well, let me explain it this way. A manufacturer who sticks to old equipment cannot compete and must fail. To survive, he must persuade people to risk savings in his business. He can then buy new equipment, increase production, and show a profit.
And he keeps the profit.
Oh no, that's what a lot of people think. But he doesn't. Out of profit, he must pay dividends to investors. Profit must be put back into the business to buy newer and better machinery.
Spend his profit on machinery? Oh, when does it all end?
It never ends. Constant replacement with the latest machinery makes the industry more efficient, thus enabling it to pay higher wages and still make a profit. This efficient operation also results in more goods of better quality and produces them at a lower cost to everyone.
By thunder, if that's the way it's done, I'll do it.
What? Now watch, Sylvester, and pay attention. 50 years ago, the standard of living was low. People worked long hours for little pay. But because people's savings were used to back good ideas, and industry plowed back earnings, new products appeared. New and more efficient industries made more jobs and higher wages, and shorter working hours to enjoy the higher standard of living.
Hey, that figures, you know?
Yeah, it sure does. So, without the use of savings for capital investment, there would be no new industries, no new jobs, no improvement in products, and no progress.
I got the money, fellas. I got it.
What you trying to do? Upset our whole economic structure?
You don't put it back! And that's why investment is so important. Now what do you say, Sylvester?
Okay, investment. Sakes. You'd have saved me a lot of headaches if you figured out a way to take it with you. Sakes.
Anyway, Scrooge was actually an altruistic character. And if you could take a look at it even further, just imagine what's happened just in the last 50 years. This cartoon's 50 years old. Laptops, DVD players, electronics, television cameras that have shrank down to size, microphone systems, progress. We had a lot of the internet. You know, to me, Scrooge kind of missed the boat a little bit. He did not need the ghosts. He simply just needed to understand his role as an entrepreneur. And you know, there's a gentleman in this next short video that's going to tell us about what the role of an entrepreneur is. And once he embraced life, you almost have to be one. Here we go.
Now, no one disputes that all economic systems reflect the intrinsic self-concern of human beings. But only capitalism creates a group of people known as entrepreneurs who have no choice but to concern themselves with the needs and desires of others. These others are their customers. Few economists, however, actually study the behavior of these entrepreneurs, the creative leaders of capitalist businesses. If they did, they would discover that entrepreneurs, by the very nature of what they do, must shun greed. First and foremost, responding to others is the very opposite of greed. Second, greed in the economic sphere is normally expressed as the immediate consumption of goods and services. I grab what I can without regard for others. But entrepreneurs must begin by saving, which is defined as foregoing consumption to achieve long-term goals. Often it takes months, sometimes many years, to bring a new product or service to market. Furthermore, entrepreneurs must collaborate with others, building teams to achieve their aims. In designing their goods and services, they must, once again, focus not on their own needs, but on the needs of others. This, too, is the opposite of greed. So what entrepreneurs do when they seek profit is far more than self-interest. Rather, profit is a measure of how well a company has served others. Under capitalism, a business prospers only if customers voluntarily trade for its output. And it's only by improving its service to others that a business can thrive and grow. If the entrepreneur pursues his own interests first and his customers' interests second, his business will fail. And sooner or later, an altruistic entrepreneur will surpass him. Capitalism at its essence, then, is a competition of giving. Of course, self-interest is involved, but the genius of capitalism, and only capitalism, is that it channels self-interest into altruism. Entrepreneurs can only help themselves by helping others. All those who have started a business and made great sacrifices to do so know the drama that first day. Does the world want what I have to give? Whether it's an immigrant opening a beauty salon or Steve Jobs selling an Apple computer, success is far from guaranteed. In fact, it's just the opposite. Those courageous souls, the entrepreneurs who are the beating heart of capitalism, who bring us the endless material benefits we enjoy, from ATM machines to life-saving medicines, should be held up for admiration, not torn down. Altruism is the very reason for capitalism's existence, and why it remains the hope of civilization. I'm George Gilder for Prager University.
Join Prager University, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and sign up for free at prageru.com.
And I understand too the powerful essence of capitalism. And I understand too that if it's diluted and divulged fairly, these multinationals would not have the power unless you guys chose to do business with them. A lot of the governments around the world are here. However, there is a little bit things. My next video is about Scrooge. He's an honest businessman. And also, he was no fool. The next part is about an 8-minute, 40-year-old cartoon that's going to explain some of the snake oil of isms.
America is many things to many people. To a 17-year-old kid, it's the malt shop on the corner. To Grandpa, it's the front porch in the cool of the evening. To Mother and her family, it's church on Sunday morning. And to Dad, it's his favorite relaxation. It's the Cracker Barrel philosophers in Crabtree Corners. And it's the tycoons in Wall Street. It's all races, creeds, and religions. It's freedom to work at the job you like. Freedom of speech and to peaceably assemble.
That's what goes on here.
Security from unlawful search or seizure.
Where's your warrant, Flatfoot?
The right to a speedy and public trial. Protection against cruel punishments and excessive fines. The right to vote. And to worship God in your own way. It is these freedoms that have made America strong.
Okay, so we got our freedom. But management's lousing up everything.
Labor is at fault. It's ruining the country.
My constituents, as your elected representative, I can assure you Labor's right, management's right. I'm strictly neutral.
Labor, management, politicians, fooey. They can't tell corn from oats.
Why, only take the money out of
Hurry, step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery, isn't. Ism will cure any ailment of the body politic. It's terrific. It's tremendous. Once you swallow the contents of this bottle, you'll have the bountiful benefits of higher wages, shorter hours, and security. Enormous profits, no strikes. Remember, you're the big boss. Government control, no worry about votes, name your own salary. Bigger crops, lower costs. Why, ISM even makes the weather perfect every day. And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ISM promises to take care of me forever.
Pardon me. And who are you, my good man?
I'm John Q. Public.
Ah, my fine friend, you're just in time to share this generous and gigantic offer. Sign right here.
Mind if I read it first?
Hurry up!
Keep your shirts on, boys. Freedom. Freedom? What? Sign away my freedom? Why, this is ridiculous.
Don't be corny, brother.
Sure, our system of free enterprise isn't perfect. But before we throw it away for some imported double talk, let's turn the clock back a few years to see what it's done for us. For example, back in the 1890s, Joe Dokes was just a guy who liked to tinker around his barn. Some people thought Joe was lazy. Some even thought he was nuts. But one day, he had an idea. And because he was free to dream and tinker, Joe had a chance to make something of himself with his idea. So, of course, some people didn't think so much of Joe's idea. But that didn't stop him. So Joe got some money from young Aunt Minnie and Uncle Angus and Grandpappy and Mr. Titus. When Joe's friends and relatives used their savings to help him buy tools and property, they were capitalists. Don't blush, folks. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Now, naturally, Joe needed some help. So he hired Willie Lumpkin, who was out of work anyway, and before long, Willie had the know-how and became skilled labor. Because capital, management, and labor worked together, Joe's idea grew. It grew and did things even he never dreamed of. Today, the automobile industry provides millions of jobs that never existed before. And remember, this is a story of only one industry. There are thousands more scattered all over the United States whose history of development is pretty much the same. We've built a country under the American system that sends more young people to high school and college than all the rest of the world combined. Why, even in the Depression, our wages, more food, clothing, travel, and entertainment than the wages of any other people in the world. Our country has a national income equal to the total national incomes of any other six nation in the world. With only 7% of the Earth's people, we drive 70% of the world's automobiles. That's just a sample of the things the capitalistic system has given us in only 160 years. Before signing up, you boys ought to try a little taste of Dr. Ism's formula to see what you get in exchange for your freedom. Go ahead, try it.
You can't do this to me! I'll strike!
The state forbid strikes.
Wait till the union hears about this!
the Union. Welcome to our ranks, number 1313.
I'll take this case to the Supreme Court.
The state is the Supreme Court. Our decision is as follows. No more private property. No more you.
Well, the farm folk will put a stop to this.
Farmers don't vote anymore.
What'll I do for seed next year?
You won't have to worry about next year. The state will do your planning from now on.
We must fight to regain our freedom, or everything is lost. Everything!
Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine.
When anybody preaches disunity, tries to pit one of us against the other through class warfare, race hatred, or religious intolerance, you know that person seeks to rob us of our freedom and destroy our very lives. And we know what to do about it.
And now, gentlemen, no violence, please. And don't throw those bottles. Don't throw those bottles.
Working together to produce an ever greater abundance of material and spiritual values for all. That is the secret of American prosperity.
I may think at some point that Scrooge may have been right. He was no fool. Scrooge never took advantage of anybody in business. He was honest and ethical in his dealings, according to the Dickens novel. And Scrooge was no fool. He knew about the schemes of the poor, the schemes of the government and the workhouses and all that other stuff. But he found that, maybe perhaps sometimes the charitable efforts of government don't work. Now here's where I think about it, most of it. We all know what we need to do with things like healthcare, police protection, fire protection, and all this other stuff in healthcare. Some goods have to be provided by the government, as well as essential services like roads, bridges, maintenance, things like that. And most everybody I know will pay taxes for it. What I don't think people really want to pay for, though, is people getting on, is for like special favors to corporations, or people who are taking advantage of the government benefits. I honestly think that, my argument's not to eliminate all government benefits or goals, but it's also not to so overburden us with taxes when they go way out of whack. A lot of people talk about the joys of living in Scandinavia. Well, I'll tell you something. When their tax rate's been high and their social benefits have been high, they have stagnated economically. When they slow down and cut taxes, when their government benefits are not as high as they once were, but more down to a better level, they prosper. There's a role for government, and there's a role for policy. What worries me is not so much Scrooge, but Trump and his tariffs and his tearing up of our free trade agreements and of his general isolationism of the United States. We've heard this same argument before World War II, with our America First campaign in the 30s, Lindbergh, everybody else. When we engage globally and we have trade and other countries choose to do so, they prosper. It's been proven in India. China just recently did it. The Southeast Asian countries have done it. Now, why hasn't Africa and maybe several of the South American countries haven't? Because their governments have not given them the chance to connect to the global network of capitalist countries. And why is there so much a big poor around a lot of these undeveloped nations, it's because the poor in a lot of times are very industrious, but they just don't have the ownership of their land, labor, and capital, and the government doesn't really want it. Scrooge, yeah, he knew what ownership was all about. He knew what everything else was all about. Scrooge is no fool. He was able to take a small fortune and turn it into a larger fortune. Yes, we may, but like any of the other people at that type of level, he did prefer social contact. Yes, the ghosts may have helped him come out of his shell and make him a little bit more joyous in life. But in the end, Scrooge was an honest businessman. He suffered no fools. And I think we really ought to applaud this guy for running a legitimate business and a banking service. Praise him for what he is, an effective entrepreneur. He finally listened to his employees, like Bob Cratchit, raised his wage, helped himself out a little bit more as he was able to enjoy some of his wealth. And my friends, that's all there is. Scrooge was an entrepreneur, and he was a capitalist. Now, let's get our panel up here so we can take your questions. I think he might do better than Trump, to be honest with you, but we'll see. Let me get the, I'm going to turn off the screen now, and let's take questions. Okay. Corina, go ahead.
I don't have a question, I'm a speaker.
All right. Anybody want to?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, yeah.
No, females first, that's our new rule.
Oh, sorry.
All right, go ahead.
Me?
Yes, you.
I'd like to know where you got all this backstory on Scrooge. That he was started out poor and became an entrepreneur and all this stuff. In the story, he was just a rich guy. They didn't tell you how he got that way or what happened to him. You know, there was no. You're giving him all of these attributes that weren't even part of the story.
Read the book. No, there's a lot of it there, and you know, a lot of it too is probably from some of the characterizations of the Hollywood movies. But I honestly think Scrooge. You want to comment a little bit?
He wasn't poor. He was.
He grew up in a he grew up in a boarding home or whatever, and then who was his first boss? Whatever his name was.
Fezziwig.
Yeah, he started off there, and I think he just moved up the corporate ladder, right? And then. Did you want to comment on that?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, the Ghost of Christmas Past showed him in the boarding home.
Yes. So I guess he did have a privileged upbringing to a degree, but he also had a bad religious.
He didn't describe it as a luxurious.
Yeah, he didn't, and he also didn't have a relationship with his father either. He had to like come home. Like his sister came to him to bring him home. So.
Yes.
If you want to check out more of Scrooge's backstory, it's the Ghost of Christmas Past.
I would argue a dysfunctional
family. Yeah. Jonathan.
Thanks for a great talk. I got here a little late, but I'm glad
Louder,
you
Jonathan, so we can hear you.
I'm pretty loud. I think I can hear. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it just always seems like people in powerful, wealthy, influential countries in history, especially this one that we happen to all be blessed to live in, people learn the golden rule after they're out of power to do something about it in policy. So you see the generals leave the military-industrial complex, and then they say we should scale down wars of resource grabbing and strategic position grabbing and wars of opportunity. You see presidents suddenly becoming very pro the Scandinavian countries' policies. Like Jimmy Carter is way more popular as a post-president as he ever was in office.
All right.
Why is that there's this pattern that they always learn the golden rule once they can't do anything in policy about it in the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world?
Jonathan?
And I don't have an answer to that, so I'm just...
Well, I honestly think in a lot of cases you're just dead wrong. The reason I say that is a lot of people, when they get into political power, try to go in and do the right thing. And I do know that once they get into power, There's a lot of special interests involved. There's a lot of systemic issues with government. There's a lot of policies and procedures that need to be followed. And sometimes, I think they're well-meaning, but it takes a lot of courage to do the right thing and not get buried in bureaucracy. I know myself, a lot of times with my own job, that it's a real struggle sometimes to do the right thing for the customer or the right thing for the company. And you feel a little bit of moral dilemma sometimes. The best thing you can do about it is to, go by your moral courage.
1775. That's the best thing.
Well, that they did in 1775, but we don't need a violent revolution here. What we simply need to do, I think, is just bring more capital back into capitalism, bring more education of values to our kids and everything else, and let the innovation engine keep going forward. In other words, let government be the one who gives the tools of capitalism to people.
I agree. I have nothing to add to that.
All right, Corina.
My example would have been law enforcement against prohibition. These are police officers that talk about the evils of the drug war, and when you see them, it's very clear that they're all retired. We need to have active police officers arguing against the drug war. And my answer to you is why it's politically expedient and it's cowardice. So it takes balls to go. I don't think Clinton was ever against gay marriage. I don't think he ever wanted to make marijuana a Schedule I substance. Political expedience, pragmatism, politics.
Just a quick follow-up. In 1775, it was, to your point, a militant action. But I think their example wasn't militant only. I think their example was what's the best way to get the most people involved in making this a better world where the golden rule is common practice. And I would think with the tools that we have today, in this country especially, peaceful and democratic mass mobilization for general strike where no violence or militant action would be necessary at all if everybody participates is well within our reach.
It can be, but I think it's a pipe dream. Anyway, next question.
I still keep
All right, Charlie, we'll get you next.
Yeah, keep talking here about this innovation engine. A month ago, I gave a little talk here, and the innovation engine produced 24 toys, which are dangerous for children. They're selling them as gifts. People buy these gifts for their children at Christmas. They're harmful. And then they confiscate entire containers at the ports of toys that are dangerous, that leach plastics. And you're telling me let loose the innovation engine?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
It doesn't care if children get hurt?
Because law enforcement...
Yeah, wait a minute. And then they design all the product design. And they don't know these products are harmful to children. A guy who makes toys doesn't know that a toy is dangerous?
Charlie, I'm going to say one thing. You can, capitalism is not a perfect system.
It hurts children.
Okay? But, the mere fact that the toys were confiscated at the border ought to tell you something about the effectiveness of rules and law enforcement.
Government.
And the government. And there's a role for government to play.
What does that guy say next to you about government?
And I think he'll agree with me too.
Giving out harmful toys knowingly is a violation of the non-aggression principle, and therefore I do not support it.
Yeah, but the system does it.
I don't think that there's any incentive to give out harmful toys. I think, I know Mattel had the microwave had the light bulb, and little kiddies burnt their fingers on the light bulb. And so they stopped it, they changed the product. Shit is going to happen.
No big deal.
Cars, recalls happen all the time. We just had a massive recall on romaine lettuce. But it's not advantageous to
for
me to give out a product that's going to cause your 5-year-old to be injured or maimed. There's no advantage or interest in my part to do that.
If you made a profit.
If you're going to give out products that are harmful on purpose, then you're going to kill the people that are going to give you money. So it's not in your interest to kill off your potential base of customers.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I'm gonna take my brother next, Chris.
Tim, are you insinuating that the real villain was Bob Cratchit because he didn't get off his lazy ass to find a better paying job or to start up his own business and go head to head with Scrooge while he was slowly killing Tiny Tim by humiliating himself every day to Scrooge?
No, I think Bob Cratchit was a loyal employee who basically had a loyalty with Scrooge.
He was killing Tiny Tim.
I don't think he was killing Tiny Tim. He had 6 other mouths to feed. And Tiny Tim probably should, I will fault Cratchit for one thing. Maybe he should have dedicated more of his salary to Bob. Maybe Bob Cratchit should have divulged a little bit more resources to Tiny Tim's medical care. But if you remember back at that time, they really couldn't do much for a chronic illness for Tiny Tim. I do know that with a good doctor and good care, it came through. Who will get you? Yes.
Yeah, it's a question of employee ownership of a company. If the employees buy shares in stock, or the public buys shares in stock, can't that be interpreted as a form of socialism? I mean, you're getting capitalism and you're getting socialism at the same time.
I would like to answer that.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
If you're gonna say that if socialism is defined as the worker ownership of the means of production, and you go to a stockbroker and you own a piece of a company, I would argue that could be owning the piece of the means of production and therefore a form of voluntary 19th century understanding of the word socialism.
All right, we're going to go with him next, and then we'll go with you. Yes, go ahead.
My arms hurt.
Give him a mic.
All right. So when I gave my lecture on left-wing market anarchism, one of the things I said was there's a school of economic thought called distributism, and the guy G.K. Chesterton said the problem of capitalism is not that there are too many capitalists, it's that there are too few capitalists. So if we can increase the number of individuals and collectives who own means of production, factories, tools, 3D printers, whatever you want to talk about, then we can achieve socialist and capitalist goals at the same time, which is the equal distribution of wealth and opportunity. That said, there is a problem of distribution of opportunity in society today in economics. A lot of times when you go to work for a company, you're expected to sign a non-competition clause and or contract that's for several years, and then you can't use the. Yeah, do you think that's kind of true? I mean, I want to say to Justin, like, if you want to define socialism as worker ownership, then you might slip and kind of think that ownership is going to be exactly like capitalist ownership, and it's really societal management by the worker. It's not necessarily the same form of ownership under capitalism. Do you guys agree that this kind of idea, this kind of thinking is a way to resolve socialism and capitalism?
Let him Justin, I think I'll let you take that one.
I think that you can. I think that I want to make it easier for anybody to participate in the marketplace, whether it be individuals or people collectively doing things and managing their enterprise in a equitable fashion. So, I mentioned in my talk Publix and Whole Foods and stuff like that, so there's a degree of that already kind of exists, and I would hope that if there's any impediments in the way to stop more of Publix and more what's that brewing company? Fats. Who makes Fat Tire again? They're a worker-owned co-op. So I'm for.
Some monopoly.
I'm for making more of those if people want to open up those, and I guess that's a way to reconcile capitalism and socialism. I think that the key to that would be the free market. So.
Free monopolies.
Okay, I got a question.
Just as soon as I answer this last question. What the world needs is not less capitalism, but much, much more. And the reason is because a lot of the poor and undeveloping countries don't have such basic things as title or ownership or documents expressing that, or they can get banking services and loans. And the thing is, if we get the tools of capital into the poor, I think we'll see a lot more equality. Corina.
There's one version
That's
of resolving your problem of capitalism and socialism, and that's this tech optimism that you sometimes hear. Even as far back, Oscar Wilde's essay talks about machines doing a lot of the grunt work, clearing the sidewalks and doing that, and this tech optimism where we can automate the drudge work and automate that, and that will put the rest of us in utopia. You have a right to be skeptical about that, but...
Tim, you said I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of done that.
Damn. Okay, so it's been scientifically, statistically...
Hand him a mic, please. Just hand him the mic.
Sure.
We got to
Can't
hear
get this back. It's been scientifically and statistically proven that the way America got rich was by the proliferation of unions and the higher wages and the higher benefits. I was a union guy in college. I was making $12 a year, an hour, 40 years ago, 30 years ago.
That was 40
You know,
years ago.
people around here making $7 an hour 30, 40 years later. So it's scientifically and statistically proven that unions brought the middle class out of the...
What's your question?
Hold on. Everybody else gets to blab on and on. And then it's been scientifically and statistically proven that now that our wages are stagnant for decades. Our average wage, because Wall Street and monopolies and corporations in this country will not pay better. And I don't care what the media tells you how great unemployment is and employment is, it's a bunch of bullshit.
Right on.
Wages have been sucking for decades because of Wall Street and monopolies, and the media is stroking everybody around the world saying how good the economy is.
Word.
So my question, there we go. So my question is, what the hell's going on? Is the media just liars?
I'll tell you what's going on, my friend. Give me the mic back.
Get that man the mic. Run out with it.
What's going on is the law lacks enforcement of antitrust legislation. What is the problem now is the special exemptions that businesses get from the Congress. They
Because of Wall Street?
The other part of it is the lots of the external benefits that certain unqualified citizens don't get. Unions did raise wages, but they were not the only thing that raised wages. Part of it was credit. Another part of it was the simple fact that wages were going up because of Henry Ford's example of the $5 an hour workday. Other social forces came into effect, and we were modernizing. The 20s saw not only the development of, like we've seen in the last 20 years in the internet, radio was the big stock back then. It started out trading at $5 a share and went to $500 a share. There was also a big bubble back then. The big problem with the Depression, and back then, was the Federal Reserve not doing the right amount of work that it needed to do to avert a depression. What we learned. All those low wages, because we're not doing and enforcing a lot of the antitrust laws.
Unions were very big in a period after World War II. We didn't have the competition, full-on competition from Europe, because it was just simply flattened. Today, Europe and Japan. Curtis LeMay went to Japan and just carpet bombed the area. Never mind the nuclear weapons. He just bombed and bombed and bombed and bombed Japan. Clearly, you see Japan in Germany now as major forces. I was born in 1972, and what good was Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and South Korea? Who would have called them the tigers? And so that was one thing, is global competition. The other thing is automation. And so what used to take more manpower has now been automated greatly. And so these manufactured goods, you don't have 3 people per one machine, you have one person operating 10 machines in a warehouse that runs 24 hours. This automation, it certainly has affected me. Truckers, major unions, hey, how about a self-driving truck? So this automation, and that's left us with jobs like doing call center work.
Right here.
All right, Corina, you want to call on the next person?
Okay, then her
You
question.
already had one.
I didn't have one.
I know you did. Go ahead.
Okay. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah. Okay. You're talking about capital. You, Corina.
Okay, Corina, me, yes.
And Tim.
Yeah.
And you're talking about, capitalism and economy. What about people? Like people in this audience. Most people here are on Social Security. Why don't you talk a little bit about Social Security, how that was achieved, how many people died for it, and how the government keeps taking money from old people and they let them die. And is that your idea of Scrooge? Is that what Scrooge wanted?
Social Security.
Money from old people.
Social Security was designed to alleviate poverty in old age. You gotta open yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And I have no problem with Social Security. I think it's a good program. I think it needs to be financed, and I also think too that the health benefits that some of our seniors get is good. And overall, I think every country should have some kind of old age protection. There comes a time in life when you can no longer work. What I think is happening now is that our traditional retirement age has been 65, but we're living 30 years longer. Also, our population as a demographic is not 4 workers for every one full-time, but 2 workers for every person on Social Security. The point of the matter is, I think in the next few years, we're going to be seeing people living a lot longer, working a lot longer, and I honestly think that it's going to need to be around for a while, and I agree with the social benefit.
The topic tonight was Scrooge, the story of a typical capitalist or socialist propaganda in the plight of the working poor. Should Ebenezer have told the ghost to get lost? That's what the topic was, and I feel that we addressed that. It was about the novel written by Charles Dickens, 1841.
Okay. All right. Helen?
Yeah.
Helen.
Yes. My question is, I enjoyed your talk. I thought it was kind of interesting.
Okay.
But I would, the question's about neoliberalism. I think an issue that you're failing to address is the way the economy has been deregulated. So capitalism, works. It was good. We had unions, we had balance, we had regulation, we had Social Security. A lot of things were working until Reagan went in, and then underneath this all, the CIA and covert operations started deregulating to the point where we are today. Trump has just deregulated the environment. The Federal Reserve, also the bankers, has never been a good force because it was run by basically this privatized people in the 1913.
Okay.
So it's bad banking. You're talking about the ideal, and it's essentially propaganda that was probably created by the CIA, these cartoons that you're showing us.
What's your question?
This is propaganda.
All right. I got your question. Focus that camera on me because I'm going to say something that everybody needs to hear. Make sure I'm right in the middle of that frame. Ellen, you're dead wrong. What happened under Reagan was probably one of the best things that got this country going. We were at 20% interest rates back in the late 70s. We had a thing called stagflation. We also had a lot of things, and we had a recession that lasted a lot longer than we did, but around 1983, the economy started picking up. And around that same time, we took off a lot of excessive regulation. Yes, there always is going to need to be some. But in that time, there was too much. You were under the Keynesian model, and Keynes, although he may have been good for the Depression, is not the normal wear of things. And you also have to remember too, right around the mid-70s, early 80s, the world caught up to us with manufacturing. There were a lot cheaper places businesses could go to do things. And as far as these conspiracies are concerned,
Contract with America. It's a neoliberal. It's not
Let
a
him answer.
conspiracy.
I still think you're dead wrong.
It hasn't done the, yeah.
I think that getting rid of some of the less excess regulation was one of the best things that ever happened to this country. And that it allowed business to prosper.
$21,000 of debt now.
Yeah, right now, because the government's not keeping it's not using fiscal accounting policies and principles.
Yeah, no antitrust.
Okay,
The
now,
government is monopoly.
I'm standing here right now.
Andy, go ahead.
About where some of these go.
How would you, if you want to continue capitalism?
Do me a favor and hand the mic to Andy. Hand the mic to Andy real quick. Thanks. And look at that camera.
My question for any of you is, have you seen the latest reports that there's 8 or 10 billionaires that own half the wealth of the planet? Like there's 3 or 4 people that own half of America? There's all kinds of studies showing that the more inequality you get, the worse conditions are for the middle class and the poor. How would you address those issues?
I will address your question right away.
The Big Bang.
It's called antitrust legislation. It's called letting, usually those guys also have effective government contracts and monopoly power. One of the reasons that we have the massive inequality in this United States now is because of the tax loopholes we got for rich people coming in. If you look under the Trump tax bill, you'll find that there's a lot more giveaways to the rich than there is to the lower class. You need to get tax reform in. You need to get things going. There's nothing wrong with getting rich under a system. What is wrong is when it's done by theft, and when it's done by fiat, and when it's done, it's called cronyism, not capitalism. Adam Smith also railed against it. Okay, next question. Please, go ahead. Come on up and use the mic if you need to. I'm sorry, yeah. Oh, you have one already?
I had a question.
So about those,
I'm sorry,
Justin, about those billionaires who give the most in charity, isn't that, don't they give the most in charity because they have the most money, and isn't that because they kind of played the game and played by the system's rules? And if you agree that there's nothing wrong with making money within a system, aren't you kind of dismissing the idea that free markets and capitalism are reconcilable in the first place, or that whether markets and regulation are irreconcilable? Can you really trust the state, which is a monopoly, to destroy other monopolies through antitrust when it creates those monopolies in the first place by giving corporations LLC status, giving them financial and legal protections, giving them the privilege to be irresponsible with taxpayer money, subsidies, bailouts, all that kind of stuff. Intellectual property, like every company that exists, they have to apply for permission from the government, and they get to choose their name, and then that name becomes a legal corporation. They have identity to it, they have rights to it. And does the government have a place in the free market protecting these companies' rights to exact profit and make more money every year? What does that have to do with freedom?
There's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned pieces of paper that talk about ownership. As Tim had mentioned earlier, in some places like in South America, since they don't have any sort of documentation, they can't they can't transfer property, properly. I don't get I don't understand the contradiction in people giving out being philanthropists. I don't get that contradiction. If there is one.
Charity is just a band-aid on, I'm not saying that every taxpayer dollar is well spent.
But, there's a lot of...
The problem and the solution come packaged together. Charity and
Okay.
I don't know.
All right. Who hasn't had a question yet? Sid.
No, I want to speak.
Okay. David, you haven't had a question?
Please.
Not yet.
Okay. Who has not had a question yet? Okay.
Right here.
I think one of the biggest problems here is when you discuss Scrooge, you must discuss the economics of the 1840s. And when you look at Ebenezer Scrooge, he wasn't the big wealth. The wealth was still concentrated in the landed gentry, the lords, the dukes. And when you talk presidents, you have to be talking Van Buren.
Right.
It was and when you talk about the socialist ideas were just springing up at this time.
Yes, I know. There was also something called the Oregon Trail and a westward expansion, which helped contribute greatly to the demand in this country for immigrants, jobs, and the land that the government was giving away.
Yes, you can't put modern on this. It was a lot older in different times back then.
Sure you can. They were giving away land ownership, giving a title deed. Japan after World War II, that's exactly what they did, was give title deeds to the population. That's what started their capitalist revolution. Same thing in Singapore. Title deeds came out, land reform. Then they did it. Okay, anyway, who hasn't had a question yet? All right, you, and then you.
Life will be perfect.
Come on up and use the mic. Just stay right there. You can use
Could I get a
use the mic. You want to come on in?
Okay, Tim, regarding capitalism, how about the cost of capitalism to our environment? Because of everything that pollutes our environment, that's not included in the cost of the different items that you purchase. What about that?
Yeah, Tim.
It's not correct, but the true price is not reflected on what we buy.
That's because the government hasn't done something called the taxing of externalities. Meaning that if you're a responsible business, you're not going to pollute the environment, but you're going to take the cost to clean it up. The thing is, you're right about that. In a lot of cases, it's not taken. All right. We're getting fast into rebuttal time. We got one more question, and then possibly... All right, we'll take two more questions. We'll do you, and then we'll get Bob Lichtenberg. Okay, I'll give you the mic.
Merry Christmas, and thank you all again for presenting. Did any of the three of you consult George Orwell's essay on Charles Dickens from, I think, 1939? It's one of his classics.
No, I didn't.
No. Tragic. Very good. I get the rebuttals. And Tim, you said that none of the ghosts knew Scrooge's business well. Would not his former partner, Jacob Marley, have been a knowledgeable, figure to know about their enterprise of Scrooge and Marley together? Thank you very much.
He was dead, so he couldn't impart knowledge. But anyway, I get where you're coming from. All right, last question, Bob Lichtenberg.
Isn't it fairly obvious that the main point of the Christmas Carol was that capitalism was a horrible form of exploitation?
Yeah.
Dickens makes that pretty clear with Scrooge and Marley's ghost, and makes them in chains. And, Christians would have had him in hell burning, but Dickens was mild. But that's the main point, how capitalism leads to exploitation through Scrooge and Marley's types. And I think y'all missed the main point.
You missed that? You guys missed that. You didn't see it.
First off, there is a character of Fezziwig who is a capitalist, but is very well received and very well liked by people. And second off, he, as a gentleman just recently had mentioned, Scrooge isn't even the big cheese. He's a money lender. He's not the one who owns a factory or that requires little kids to crawl up and sweep the chimney and get testicular cancer. He keeps one. His victim is Bob Cratchit, a single person, not 1,000 workers. And he also isn't lavish. He's so miserly. He's miserly on himself. He lives in a very cold house. At one point, he's wiping the frost off his sleeve. So that's not the same as me slave driving you, but then driving off in my Porsche. It seemed to be a criticism of one single man, not of the capitalist system. There also was descriptions of people at Christmas time, and they were all merry and running around and running into the bakery and happily on the street.
It's not an indictment of capitalism. I would call it a celebration of capitalism. I would call it...
By being in chains?
No, not by being in chains. It's just a redemption of one stingy, honest capitalist to finally come and see a little bit more, that life is more, not just about money, but a little bit more of human relationships. All right.
And not only would he not donate to the poor, but he also wouldn't say Merry Christmas. He said bah humbug. I mean, it was his overall personality. What does it cost you to say Happy Holidays? I mean,
All right.
It's not even money.
It's now time, it's what, 8:04, 8:05. We got rebuttals coming up next. How many want to give a rebuttal tonight? 1, 2, 3, 4. We're probably going to have to go to a 3-minute rebuttal period with a strict clock. Andy, can you help us out on this with that, please? 3 minutes, strict clock. We have to be out within the 45 minutes. All right, first one. Let me get my laptop off and we'll get you going. All right, 3 minutes, Sid.
Yeah, capitalism.
Are you Tim's brother? Yeah. Oh. Hi. I'm Andy. Nice to meet you, Andy. Have we met you before here? No. No, this is your first time. What state do you live in? North Carolina. North Carolina. How are things down there, North Carolina?
Actually, capitalism
Everybody happy with
was
the government?
relatively
Watch yourself.
progressive
Not the state government.
until after the revolution, after the Civil War, when you had Reconstruction, and after the Civil War, monopolies came into being. And monopolies came into being, eventually what happened is you got a merger between the corporate sector and the financial sector. And right now we have finance, industrial type capitalism. So it's actually like the bankers that really run the place more than anything else. And all the progress that was ever made under capitalism was not done by the capitalists. It was done by the workers, and the workers struggle. And for the 8-hour day right here in Chicago, when you had the so-called Haymarket riot, and they executed a number of them. And what happened was, after a while, they got some of the benefits. But some of the benefits are always gained by struggle of one kind or another. There's no such thing as the capitalists coming along and saying, oh, you're exploited, and therefore we're going to give you some benefits. That's ridiculous. The whole thing about capitalism is the exploitation of labor. That's what it's all about. And for instance, right now, what we have is about 40% of the workforce has stopped looking for work because there is no work. And when they say 3% unemployment, it's patently ridiculous. It's just totally ridiculous that, and at this point in history, we have two crises, and the main crisis, of course, is the climate. And the capitalists don't give a damn about that. They're not doing anything about it. The only country that's actually doing something is China. They have a hybrid system that is moving into socialism. But they want to have an eco type of civilization where we do away with fossil fuels altogether, and we could have a very good future in the long run. But if you stay under capitalism, what is actually happening is capitalists are killing everybody in this country, including themselves, and they're like lemmings. And if you keep going like it is, what's going to happen is you're not going to have a planet to live on. There won't be any food, there won't be any water. If you keep up with capitalism, that's going to happen. And if you talk to some of these capitalists, the only thing they know is 3 months, we gotta have dividends. And if we don't have the dividends, it's no good. And we don't care what we do to the environment, everybody could die so we could have profits.
Yeah.
The whole thing is nothing but profits, and we have to do away with the system unless it does away with us.
Yeah.
Mr. Smith comes to Chicago.
I really loved it when one of the speakers said, what we need to have is every piece of property should have a title. And I've heard this before, and I'm looking at all of the systems that people thrived under that were not capitalist, where there was community property and people looked after each other and they owned things in common. And this is what capitalism cannot tolerate. There was examples of that after the Civil War when black communes got together and the government couldn't stand it.
Oh, that's yours.
And they went in and killed them. Okay, so there's a great fear of community property. And the idea is that every single piece of property has to have a title and an owner. I wanted to say something else about capitalism, which I'm calling rent-seeking behavior.
No, I didn't get it.
And rent-seeking behavior is defined as a person or the kind of behavior that seeks to accumulate wealth that is already existing in culture and is seeking that wealth that already exists and wants to accumulate that wealth without adding anything to the culture. And this is called rent-seeking behavior, and it is, to me, Wall Street banking and things like now Apple and Amazon and Facebook and all of those people who are seeking to accumulate wealth. And I just wanted to have one little joke. There were 2 storks sitting at the table in breakfast, and one of the storks was stirring his coffee, and the other stork was reading the paper. And the one who was reading the paper said, "Oh, I see where Amazon is going to start delivering babies."
I'll give her my 3 minutes. I want to thank the panel for their propaganda. It was impressive. I really felt like capitalism was our savior. It isn't. But I wanted to particularly bring up one subject that came up briefly, that's Social Security, and how wonderful it is and how great it is for us. The fact is, when it was introduced by President Roosevelt in 1933, it was defeated by the Republican Congress at that time. It finally got passed in 1937, but when it was passed, there was a little anomaly there. The retirement age was 65, but the average life expectancy of a male in 1937 was 48 years. So there's a discontinuity. Quite right.
I mean, this is socialist.
Good evening. I'm David Travis.
Hi, David.
Ebenezer Scrooge was a man who went to a boarding school to be educated because his father hated him. He hated him because his mother died in childbirth with Ebenezer. And Ebenezer was not welcome to come home for holidays. He was made to stay in that orphanage or that boarding school. And it caused him to be very embittered. And when Scrooge finally graduated from all of that and he went on his own, he went to work for a real nice man who was a businessman, and he remembered him fondly. But Scrooge still harbored his anger for what was done to him. Now Scrooge had only one person that he really loved, and that was his sister. And his sister died in childbirth with his nephew. So Scrooge wouldn't have anything to do with his nephew. Although when his nephew was grown and married, he invited Scrooge many times to come for Christmas celebrations and other celebrations. But Scrooge wouldn't do that because he hated his nephew just as his father had hated him. So it wasn't until these ghostly visitations and so forth caused Scrooge to turn over a new leaf. And he went to his nephew and his nephew's wife, and he asked them to forgive him. Scrooge was basically an embittered old man. His friends that he went to school with grew up and became successful people. They became proctors and medical men. They became industrialists and so forth, and had a very good slant on life. But not Scrooge. Scrooge was angry about the things that were done to him by his own family, by his own father. And that's why Scrooge did those things. The fact is that in capitalism, in the free market, one can make a lot of money. A man of good common sense can make a great deal of money in the marketplace. You don't have to have a lot of money to begin with, although I hear people say it takes money to make money. That's not really the case. The fact is, a man can make a great deal of money starting with very little money. And I'll give you an example of this. If you start out with $1,000 and you double it only 10 times, do you know how much money you will have? Does anyone have an idea? You'll be worth way over $1 million. Because it goes $1,000 to $2,000 to $4,000 to $8,000, etc. And upon the 10th time, you're worth way over $1 million. Now, you might say, yeah, but where are you going to double your money 10 times? Well, in the early 1970s, you could have done that with a bankrupt railroad called the Penn Central that went from $1 to $2 and back to $1 and back to $2 and back to $1 and back to $2, and it did that umpteen dozens of times. So you can become wealthy in the free marketplace, and it doesn't matter how much money you start out with. It matters how you invest your money. And if you can double it just 10 times, you have become a millionaire. So you can't blame capitalism for our plight. The blame that I will lay is this. We have a government that tells us this is a capitalist system. This is a free market. All you got to do is go out there and with some elbow grease and you can make it. Then the government says, we want this much in taxes. We want this much in licenses. I remember I opened a bookstore.
Your time is up.
One moment. I remember I opened a bookstore and the government charged me. They charged $35 for a license. All of a sudden, it was $300. No, the government is the one that is the culprit that makes life miserable for us. Thank you, and I'm sorry I overstayed my speech.
It's the holidays.
All right.
Conrail,
Reagan couldn't have said it anyway.
All right, next.
That's good, that's all I need. Yeah, that's good.
Yes, I need them signed.
We've never been closer to the dream of humanity than right now in history. And I know I could be pretty cynical on some nights, but I'm feeling pretty altruistic this holiday season. It's proof that we're closer to the dream than ever before in one of the most beautiful places in the world to be, Chicago, Illinois, because we have two of the hardest working freedom of speech advocates that we've ever had, who is Tim Paydock and Charlie Bolger. And I just, once again, I want to say on a spiderweb string budget, not just a shoestring budget, you're accomplishing the dream of many grassroots organizers that didn't get to see this day in history. So, which one of you likes balloons and which one of you likes boats better?
I like boats.
Balloons.
Balloons for Charlie. Okay, Charlie, happy holidays. I have America, the Farewell Tour by Chris Hedges for you. Thank you again for your advocacy for freedom of speech. We appreciate it. On behalf of humanity. And for Tim, I have by Thomas Frank, Rendezvous with Oblivion. Happy holidays. Thank you for your freedom of speech advocacy on behalf of humanity. If I could be so humble to speak for humanity for 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, do it right now. Right now.
Just
All right, so I was thanking the people who make this possible. Otherwise, people like me would be wandering aimlessly through the park. Okay, that doesn't cut into my time. 1:34. Announcement now.
Hi, sorry, but did anybody order a beer battered cod that I did not give their check to? Beer battered cod?
Mine was comped, but yeah.
Right.
Or should be.
Yeah, yours was. Yours was taken care of. Okay. Well, no, I probably double ordered it, but I'm just like, everybody got their check. Sorry.
I'm a big fan of cods, so I'm actually glad.
Thank you.
You're a mean one, Mr.
Don't insult the Grinch like that.
Don't insult the Grinch like that.
You're a mean one, Mr. Trump. You really are a heel. You're as cuddly as a cactus. You're as charming as an eel, Mr. Trump. You're a bad banana with a greasy black peel. You're a monster, Mr. Trump. Your heart's an empty hole. Your brain is full of spiders. You've got garlic in your soul, Mr. Trump. We wouldn't touch you with a 39.5-foot pole. You're a vile one, Mr. Trump. You have termites in your smile. You have all the tender sweetness of a seasick crocodile, Mr. Trump. Given the choice between the two of you, I'd take the seasick crocodile. You're a rotter, Mr. Trump. And everyone else in your cabinet, your heart's a dead tomato splashed with moldy purple spots, Mr. Trump. You're a 3-decker sauerkraut and toadstool sandwich with arsenic sauce. You're nauseatous, Mr. Trump. Yes. With a nauseous super nos. You're a crooked, dirty jockey, and you drive a crooked horse, Mr. Trump. Your soul is an appalling dump heap overflowing with the most disgraceful assortment of rubbish imaginable, mangled up and tangled up nuts. Last verse. I know I'm over time, but you had like 25 minutes. So. You're a foul one, Mr. Trump. You're a nasty, waspy skunk. Your heart is full of unwashed socks. Your soul is full of gunk, Mr. Trump. And Mike Pence.
The three words that best describe you and your political philosophy and platforms are as follows, and we quote, everybody together who knows this: stink, stank, stunk! Happy holidays!
Do we have more rebutters? Let's go.
I agree with the people of tonight who talked about the uselessness of antitrust and how capitalism is the relentless pursuit of profit, sometimes with guarantees from bailouts from the government. I just wanted to comment on what I think is meant by give unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. I don't interpret that as, I'm not personally a Christian or anything, but I interpret that as not a call for paying your taxes necessarily, but a call to, if it has Caesar's face on it, give it back to them. I mean, we're collecting pictures of dead people who owned slaves, and we should admit that. And we have to remember at the holiday season, Jesus was a person who flipped over the tables of the money changers in the temple. He was ransomed for 30 pieces of silver. His life was reduced to his value in silver. The right to kill him was sold. He was also the God of the poor. After he was born in a barn, in a stable, he was laid in an animal's feeding trough. That's literally what a manger is. He was born among dirt, and that is why he's beloved by so many poor people. And if you can watch movies like Brother, Sun, Sister Moon, The Song of Bernadette, and the films of a guy named Jodorowsky, and also if you read Acts 4:32, which describes not just the apostles but all the believers sharing all their possessions in common, and not one of them thinking that one of those possessions was one of their own. You don't need to call this socialism if you don't want to, but just remember there's ways to reconcile free markets, which I think is distinct from capitalism, with socialism, and that's a system where people can freely give and accept what's freely given, and give, trade, barter, share, pay it forward, give without the expectation or guarantee of receiving. And I think that's the spirit of giving, and if we can just not chew people out for receiving things that were freely given to them or accepting opportunities, then we can have a more fair society and a fair market system. Thanks.
All right. Margaret.
Okay, some of this reminded me of a sign that I saw in a truck stop convenience store, which is like one of the big gathering places for people from the working class. And the sign said, if you can't convince them with facts, baffle them with bullshit. So I think that, when you look at our so-called capitalist system, you see people being greedy and doing things, and someone said they don't do it deliberately, but that in fact is bullshit. When Ralph Nader wrote his Unsafe at Any Speed, he condemned the car companies for producing cars that they knew were unsafe, and documentation in the records when they were finally sued for it proved that they knew that they were unsafe, and they kept producing them because they figured that they would spend less in paying for the people that died than they would for changing a little part for $5. So that happened. Being in the above 65 generation right now, we're getting more and more experience with the big pharma and with medical insurance, and we're very grateful for Medicare. And we're finding out, though, that Big Pharma is going ahead at full speed. And if anybody saw Michael Moore's film Sicko, you see that the CEO of United Health, which is one of the health insurance agencies that manages the medical gap policies, people who have Medicare but want insurance to cover the other 20%, has 2 or 3 or 4 houses, multi-million-dollar houses, pays the people that work for him. Really, he makes like 40 times more than they do. And the people who have been paying their insurance policies and paying their premiums get denied when they have problems. And so one of the things that Michael Moore's movie went over were the people who got denied when they actually had health insurance. And because they were denied benefits, they died. they half of the bankruptcies were because people were due to medical catastrophe things, and so this is bullshit. The thing that with the charity is that it really does reinforce the quote-unquote system, because what happens is that then they don't have to pay the real costs of really positive charities like education, public education. They're trying to privatize education now, and it's a failure. They're trying to defeat Medicare and defund Medicare and defund Social Security as we speak. So they don't want to pay for people. They don't want to have that health insurance safety net for people, or money and safety net for elderly people.
Give me a second, I don't know, I gotta find the check. He was gonna look for it, but he won't give me 5 minutes, so.
Go ahead.
Just giving her a chance to get out of the way because she's on a mission. Okay. Tim was talking about Reagan and how great he was. One example was how he deregulated corporations to give them, just open up opportunities for them to make money. But then later he was confronted with some of the problems of corporations, and he said, oh no, well, that's the government's fault because they need to step in and make laws like antitrust laws. So I'm kind of hearing this cherry picking where sometimes the government it's the government's fault if corporations aren't doing things right, but then the government's at fault if they're regulating them. He kept using the word innovation. Innovation is driving everything. Well, the reality is that corporations don't give a crap about innovation. Their motivation is profit. Okay? If they can make a ton of money without any innovation at all, a ton of money, they're going to be rewarding those managers. Okay? It has nothing to do with innovation. What drives innovation is the opportunity to make a ton of money. Let me give you an example of innovation. Pharmaceutical companies come up with an opioid-based drug to treat people with serious chronic pain, and what innovative way do they come up with to increase profits? They tell their sales reps, go out and tell the doctors, give them suggestions on other things that they can start using these painkillers for. And so you see this massive increase in the prescription of opioid drugs. And now what do we have? A national health crisis. We literally, I just read this in the paper 2 weeks ago. Heroin, for the first time, is no longer the #1 drug that kills people. It's fentanyl. A prescribed drug by our wonderful, innovative corporations. Here's another example of innovation. Fire retardant chemicals. Okay, they went out and these chemical corporations said these furniture companies, they need these fire retardant chemicals because they're effective, the chemicals are safe, and because we know personal stories where these children have died in these fires and you could save their lives. And what happens? Every piece of furniture has these fire retardant chemicals, and they found out that they are not effective. They don't work, and they are seriously unhealthy. And they're finding, doing blood tests, that these chemicals are now basically in our blood systems. So they're still trying to figure out the long-term health problems of that. The whole talk was, is about Scrooge and is this pro-capitalist or socialist propaganda. I would say this. I think that I'd like to take a vote. If you have a choice between working for Scrooge or working for Fezziwig, who here would both work for Scrooge? And who here would work for Fezziwig? Okay, excluding the retired people. There was this is not a hypothetical. They do polls about this. Almost done. They've done polls about this. They've polled which countries are happiest. Tim was talking about how the Scandinavian companies, they're taxing too much. What's the #1 country? for where people have said, I'm happiest, it's Denmark.
Bhutan.
They're taxed like hell, but guess what? They're happy people. It's much more complicated than just innovation and profit. Thank you.
Amen to that. I'm just going to take a quick minute here. I've been giving talks here censored around this book, or the version of it every year. It's called Censored News. This is the 40th anniversary edition from 2017. And I've been giving talks based on this book, how they teach the media, it teaches journalism students how the media maintains people, otherwise intelligent people, in an incredible bubble of ignorance. People are, a few years back, a guy published an article called A Disneyland of Militant Ignorance. We live in a Disneyland of ignorance in America, and people are militant about it. And I can't wait to analyze this tape, because there were several blatant falsehoods where people outside the United States would look at us and say, what are you talking about? The benefits of capitalism. And basically, it's like ignoring the elephant in the room and talking about the benefits of something. Well, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? Other than that, Mrs. Kennedy, how did you like your trip to Dallas? That's what, other than the thing that was ignored, well, yeah, there are some benefits to capitalism. There are some benefits from the drug companies, but they don't tell you that particular drug will kill 5% of the people that take it. But it's beneficial to the other 95%, sort of, and they're making billions. I mean, it's listening to talk about the benefits of capitalism without mentioning the billionaire predators that are eating our country alive. $20,000 for a drug that used to be $100, $200. Well, I'm sorry your child is dying, but this is capitalism. We need our billions. And that's the essence. 20 years ago, 1999, John McMurtry from Canada published a book called The Cancer Stage of Capitalism. And we're in the final stages now of the cancer of unregulated capitalism, destroying the middle class all over the planet. But not in the Scandinavian countries where they regulate. Where it's regulated, they don't have these problems because they don't allow billionaire predators to run wild. That's the elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Is that understandable? We're running. Okay, go ahead.
First of all, Scrooge eventually is brought home from the school after when his sister comes to fetch him by telling him that his father is now much nicer than he once was. But apparently he still never really got over his father's earlier treatment of him. Secondly, with regard to the person who said no during the presentation of the song about Mr. Grinch and Donald Trump, I would simply say this. My criticism here is not of everyone who voted for Donald Trump. My criticism here is of what's called the Trump base. These people are responsible for virtually everything that's gone wrong with this country since President Kennedy was killed. That's number one. Number two, as far as I am concerned, these people, and Oswald was one of these folks, however sick and twisted he was. And as far as I'm concerned, the Trump base, well, these people are, in a spiritual sense, Oswald's grandchildren.
All right. Andy, I'll forego my final statement so we can get one more rebuttal in. Try to make it 2 minutes if possible so we can
I'll try and keep it snappy. So from George Orwell, and I believe this is from 1939, Dickens is one of those writers who are well worth stealing. Even the burial of his body in Westminster Abbey was a species of theft, if you come to think of it. When Chesterton wrote his introductions to the Everyman edition of Dickens' works, it seemed quite natural to him to credit Dickens with his own highly individual brand of medievalism. And more recently, a Marxist writer, Mr. T.A. Jackson, has made spirited efforts to turn Dickens into a bloodthirsty revolutionary. The Marxist claims him as almost a Marxist. The Catholic claims him as almost a Catholic. And both claim him as a champion of the proletariat, or the poor, as Chesterton would have put it. On the other hand, Nadezhda Krupskaya, in her little book on Lenin, I believe she was his widow, relates that towards the end of his life, Lenin went to see a dramatized version of The Cricket on the Hearth, another one of Dickens' Christmas novels that was less successful, and found Dickens' quote, middle-class sentimentality so intolerable that he walked out in the middle of the scene. I'll skip ahead a little to the quote that it might well have been otherwise, for even if Dickens was a bourgeois, he was certainly a subversive writer, a radical, one might say truthfully, a rebel. And he goes on to characterize how it's mostly the picture of how desperately poor, Bob Cratchit is a financial clerical worker. He is not a physical laborer. And how it's the world of the physical laborer, the factories, the farm workers that Dickens depicts rather less, with some exceptions like in David Copperfield or the workers' prisons. Anyway, I know we needed to keep it short because we've already run a bit late. The Trump base is indeed awful, and just to throw a chunk of dynamite out there, as I recall, the labor union vote did 57% roughly go for Hillary Clinton, but about 43% went for Trump, which goes to remind us that organized labor is not a panacea, and it is not even always reliably progressive. I believe in '72 they also voted the majority of organized labor for Nixon. And the Reagan Democrats phenomenon, this was repeated again. So even if a large minority of organized labor went for Trump, it may be somewhat more akin to a swing voter constituency like suburban women.
Okay.
Whites of a certain college age education level. Thank you.
All right, we have two speakers. We have two speakers now who have got to make a final rebuttal. I'm going mine. We got less than about 3 minutes, so please get up there and be brief.
It's got to be brief.
I just want to say Merry Christmas, everybody, and free markets are the best. Thank you.
All right, Corina.
I agree with the last rebutter, or with the commentary that the last rebutter read. A Christmas Carol was not meant to be to stoke a revolution. It was not meant to be inflammatory. It actually was meant to help Charles Dickens pay off his debt. He was grossly in debt and needed to make a buck. I thought that Dave Travis had some truly insightful comments during his rebuttal, and thanks all and happy holidays.
Gavel us out, Andy. Gavel us out.
That's it for the College of Complexes on December 22nd here. We will see you all next week and have a happy holidays, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day.